Every parent's worst nightmare was about to come true on the dusty main street of Dry Creek, Wyoming. A mother was going to lose her child, not to death or disease, but to men who saw a little girl as nothing more than payment for debt. Sariah Harwell clutched her 8-year-old daughter close as 3 bank collectors surrounded them in 1882. Her husband had died owing money, and these men wanted the child as collateral. The whole town watched from their doorways, but nobody moved to help. Sariah begged and pleaded, but the men just smiled coldly. Then a giant of a man stepped out from the shadows. Jeremiah Cole was scarred from the war and hadn't spoken a word in 20 years. He was known as the silent mountain man who kept to himself. But when he saw what was happening to this mother and child, something inside him stirred. He walked slowly toward the collectors, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the street. What could drive a broken man to risk everything for strangers he'd never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other for Sariah Harwell, with the cruel certainty that today might be her last on the land her husband had died trying to protect. She stood at the cracked window of their one-room cabin, watching the sun paint the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and amber, while her 8-year-old daughter Katie slept peacefully on the narrow cot they shared. The simple gold wedding band that had adorned Sariah's finger for 10 years now lay wrapped in a handkerchief on the wooden table, her final possession of any value, pawned yesterday to buy them 3 more days of grace from the collectors. Benjamin Harwell's survey map still hung on the cabin's only interior wall, its edges yellowed and corners torn from countless examinations. The careful lines and notations meant nothing to Sariah beyond marking the boundaries of their 160-acre homestead. But Benjamin had spent countless evenings studying those papers with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She'd asked him once what captured his attention so completely, and he'd simply smiled and said the land held more promise than either of them realized. Now, 18 months after his death, in what the town doctor had called a tragic accident with his horse, those cryptic words seemed like whispers from beyond the grave. The cabin itself told the story of their struggle in every weathered board and patched chink. Benjamin had built it with his own hands in the summer of 1878, when they'd first claimed this remote corner of the territory. The walls still bore the marks of his careful craftsmanship, each log fitted with the precision of a man who understood that winter in Wyoming showed no mercy to shoddy construction. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing smoke efficiently, even in the worst storms. Shelves lined another wall, now mostly empty, except for a few tins of beans and a sack of flour that would last perhaps another week if Sariah rationed carefully. Katie stirred on the cot, her small face peaceful in sleep despite the uncertainty that clouded their days. She had her father's auburn hair and gentle disposition, but her mother's steel-gray eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. The child had accepted their reduced circumstances with a grace that both amazed and broke Sariah's heart. When other children in town whispered about the poor widow woman and her daughter, Katie would simply lift her chin and declare that her mama was the strongest person in all of Wyoming territory. 5 miles up the winding mountain trail that led away from Dry Creek, another soul was beginning his daily ritual of survival and solitude. Jeremiah Cole's cabin perched on a rocky outcrop like an eagle's nest, commanding a view of the entire valley below. Built from massive pine logs and chinked with mountain clay, the structure seemed to grow from the mountainside itself. Inside, the space was spartanly furnished but meticulously maintained. A single room served as living quarters, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 1 chair, and a narrow bed covered with wool blankets and a bearskin. He'd taken his first winter in the mountains. The war had ended 17 years ago. But for Jeremiah, the battles continued every morning when he woke to silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like water. The Confederate Minié ball lodged near his vocal cords was a souvenir from Gettysburg that Army surgeons declared too dangerous to remove. It had stolen his voice and, in many ways, his connection to the world of men. He tried to rejoin civilian life after the war, but the stares and awkward conversations had driven him deeper into isolation until he'd finally surrendered to the mountains that asked nothing of him but survival. His daily routine varied little. Before dawn, he would check the snares that provided much of his meat, tend to his small vegetable garden, and repair whatever the previous day's weather had damaged. Twice a month, he made the journey down to Dry Creek for supplies, moving through town like a ghost, conducting business with gestures and written notes when absolutely necessary. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to engage him in conversation, though children still pointed and whispered about the giant man with the terrible scar who lived alone in the mountains. Doc Whitfield, who ran the general store and served as the town's unofficial physician, was one of the few people who showed Jeremiah any kindness. The elderly man had served as a field surgeon during the war and recognized the particular brand of damage that came from seeing too much death too young. He never pressed Jeremiah for conversation, simply nodded acknowledgement when the mountain man appeared for supplies and accepted payment without comment. In the territorial bank that dominated Dry Creek's main street, banker Harrison Croft was reviewing the Harwell file with the satisfaction of a man about to complete a profitable transaction. The ornate building stood in stark contrast to the rough log structures that comprised most of the town, its imported brick and glass windows announcing the growing influence of Eastern capital in the Western Territories. Croft's office occupied the entire second floor, furnished with mahogany desk and leather chairs that spoke of wealth and power. The Harwell debt had grown from Benjamin's original loan of $800 to nearly $3,000 through accumulated interest and fees that Croft had applied with creative enthusiasm. The collateral agreement, signed in desperation during Benjamin's final illness, gave the bank the right to claim any and all assets in the event of default, including custody of minor children until such time as the debt could be satisfied through their labor. Such arrangements were not uncommon in the territories, where law was often whatever the most powerful men decided it should be. Territorial Judge Harrison Blackstone, who would arrive next week to formalize the proceedings, had never once ruled against the banking consortium that provided his most generous campaign contributions. The system worked smoothly for those with enough money to make it work in their favor. Sheriff Morton Webb sat in the saloon, nursing his third whiskey of the morning, contemplating the unpleasant duty that awaited him. A large man gone soft around the middle, Webb had worn the badge for 6 years without ever having to draw his gun in anger. His authority derived from the bank's backing rather than any particular courage or sense of justice. The arrangement suited him perfectly. He kept order among the drunks and drifters while leaving serious business. To men with better education and deeper pockets, the collection of the Harwell debt would be his most distasteful task yet. But Croft had made it clear that cooperation was not optional. Webb's own gambling debts to certain unsavory characters in Cheyenne left him little room for moral qualms. He would do what needed doing and try not to think too hard about the consequences for a woman and child who'd never done him any harm. As the sun climbed higher over Dry Creek, casting sharp shadows between the buildings that lined the dusty main street, the various threads of fate began to draw together. Sariah prepared Katie's breakfast with the last of their eggs, trying to keep worry from showing on her face. Katie chattered about her planned adventures for the day, blissfully unaware that men were already gathering to tear her world apart. In his mountain cabin, Jeremiah completed his morning chores and prepared for his bi-weekly trip to town for supplies. He strapped his Colt revolver to his hip, more from habit than expectation of trouble, and saddled the sturdy mountain pony that had been his only companion for 5 years. The animal, a tough little paint gelding named Scout, seemed to sense his master's mood and stood quietly while Jeremiah secured saddlebags and checked his rifle's position in its scabbard. The town of Dry Creek sprawled along both sides of the creek that gave it its name, a collection of false-fronted buildings and rough cabins that housed nearly 300 souls. The main street ran east to west, intersected by two cross streets that petered out into dirt paths leading to outlying homesteads. On the north side stood the bank, general store, saloon and hotel, the commercial heart of the community. The south side housed the sheriff's office, church, schoolhouse, and a collection of private residences ranging from modest cottages to Croft's impressive two-story mansion. Most of the residents were honest folks, trying to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers and craftsmen who had come west seeking opportunity and found mostly hard work and uncertainty. They formed a community bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence, though that solidarity had limits when powerful interests made their displeasure known. Agnes Pine, the young schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston the previous fall, represented the growing influence of Eastern education and progressive ideas in the territory. A woman of 26, with intelligent brown eyes and prematurely grey hair, she had quickly established herself as a voice for justice and compassion in community affairs. Her small schoolhouse doubled as a meeting place for the more democratically minded citizens who sometimes questioned the bank's growing influence over local politics. As the morning progressed toward the fateful confrontation that would change everything, each player in the drama moved according to patterns established by months or years of routine. None could foresee how thoroughly those patterns would be shattered by the choices made in the next few hours, or how the silence of one scarred man would prove more powerful than all their words combined. The stage was set for a collision between justice and greed, between the strong and the vulnerable, between a world that valued only profit and those who still believed that some things, family, honor, protecting the innocent, mattered more than money. In a few hours, Sariah Harwell would face the worst moment of her life, and a man who had not spoken in 20 years would find his voice in the most unexpected way. The three men arrived at Sariah's cabin precisely at noon, their polished boots and tailored suits announcing their authority before they spoke a word. Harrison Croft led the delegation, his gold pocket watch gleaming in the harsh Wyoming sun as he consulted it with theatrical precision. Behind him stood two enforcers borrowed from the territorial marshal's office, hard men with cold eyes who made their living collecting debts that others found too distasteful to pursue. "Mrs. Harwell," Croft called out, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I trust you received our final notice regarding your late husband's obligations to the First Territorial Bank." Sariah emerged from the cabin with Katie close beside her, the child's small hand gripping her mother's worn skirt. The sight of the official delegation sent ice through her veins, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Croft, I've told you repeatedly that I need more time. The harvest. Croft's laugh held no warmth. "My dear woman, 3 acres of struggling corn will hardly satisfy a debt of $3,000. Plus accumulated interest and fees." He produced a leather portfolio from his coat and withdrew several official-looking documents. "I'm afraid the time for negotiation has passed." Sheriff Webb appeared from around the cabin's corner, having approached on foot while the main delegation commanded attention. His presence sealed off any hope of escape, though where could a woman and child run in this vast wilderness anyway? He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respectful under different circumstances. "Sheriff," Sariah said, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "Surely there must be some legal recourse." "Ma'am," Webb interrupted, his discomfort evident in the way he avoided her eyes. "The law's pretty clear on matters of debt collection. Mr. Croft's got all the proper paperwork." Katie pressed closer to her mother, sensing the tension without fully understanding its implications. At 8 years old, she knew only that these men frightened her mother, and that was enough to kindle a defensive fire in her young heart. "You leave my mama alone," she declared, with all the authority her small voice could muster. One of the enforcers, a lean man with a pockmarked face and yellow teeth, chuckled at the child's defiance. "Got some spirit, this one? Should fetch a good price working in the textile mills back east. Lots of families need domestic help they can train up proper." The casual cruelty of his words struck Sariah like a physical blow. The reality of what these men intended crashed over her with devastating clarity. They weren't just taking her land, they meant to take Katie, to sell her into what amounted to legal slavery in some distant factory or household where Sariah would never see her again. "No," she whispered, then louder as desperation gave her strength. "No, you cannot have my daughter. I'll sign whatever papers you want, deed you the land, give you everything. But you cannot take my child." Croft's expression remained unchanged, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying a family. "I'm afraid that's not how contracts work, Mrs. Harwell. The collateral agreement your husband signed specifically includes all family members as potential assets. Given the scope of the debt, we'll need both the land and the child's labor contract to approach anything resembling fair compensation." The townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion and the sight of official vehicles in front of the Harwell cabin. They clustered at a safe distance, close enough to see but far enough to avoid involvement. Sariah recognized faces in the crowd, neighbors who had shared meals with her family, fellow church members who had offered condolences at Benjamin's funeral, shopkeepers who had extended credit when times were tight. Yet none stepped forward to challenge what was happening. Doc Whitfield stood near his store's front porch, his weathered face creased with concern and shame. Agnes Pine had emerged from the schoolhouse, her hands clenched into fists as she watched the proceedings with obvious distress. Even old Cyrus Beck, whose farm bordered the Harwell property, had come to witness the spectacle. But witnessing was all they dared do. "Please." Sariah's voice broke as she fell to her knees in the dirt, still clutching Katie's hand. "I'm begging you. Take everything else, but don't take my child. She's all I have left in this world." The pockmarked enforcer reached for Katie's other arm. "Come along, girl. Fighting won't make this any easier." That's when Katie screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror that echoed off the mountains and seemed to hang in the still air like an accusation against every adult who stood by and did nothing. The sound cut through the crowd's murmured conversations and uncomfortable shuffling, demanding acknowledgement of the cruelty being perpetrated in broad daylight. Jeremiah Cole heard that scream from 3 blocks away as he guided Scout down Main Street toward the general store. 20 years of mountain solitude had sharpened his hearing to an almost supernatural degree, and something in that child's cry spoke to depths of his soul that he'd thought permanently frozen. He touched his neck unconsciously, fingers tracing the scar where Confederate lead had stolen his voice and, he'd believed, his capacity to care about anyone's suffering but his own. The Confederate Minier ball had done more than damage his vocal cords. It had lodged close enough to major blood vessels that military surgeons declared it too dangerous to remove. A permanent reminder of the moment at Gettysburg, when his world had exploded in smoke and screaming and blood. For months afterward, he'd carried the bullet's weight like a stone in his throat, unable to speak above a whisper, unable to bear the sound of his own damaged voice, attempting to form words. But Katie's scream pierced through 2 decades of self-imposed isolation like a bugle call to battle. Jeremiah's hands tightened on Scout's reins as muscle memory from his days, as Captain Cole, 5th Pennsylvania Infantry, flooded back through him. He'd been a different man then, a leader of men, a tactician whose unit had never lost an engagement, a soldier who'd earned his commission through merit rather than politics or family connections. Scout sensed his master's sudden tension and pranced sideways, ears forward and alert. Jeremiah guided the horse through the crowd with gentle pressure from his knees, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with the rapid assessment that had kept him alive through 4 years of warfare. 3 armed men, 1 woman, 1 child. Uneven odds. But he'd faced worse. As he drew closer, he could see the tear tracks on Sariah's dirt-stained cheeks, the way Katie trembled while trying to be brave for her mother's sake. The sight triggered memories he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. Other women, other children caught in the machinery of powerful men's ambitions. The war had been full of such scenes, and his inability to save them all had been part of what drove him into the mountains when peace finally came. The crowd parted as Scout approached, recognizing Jeremiah's imposing figure, even if they'd never heard him speak. 6 feet, 4 inches of weathered muscle and bone, dressed in buckskin and homespun, he looked like some elemental force of the mountains themselves. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the sunlight, a pale line that spoke of violence survived and pain endured. Croft looked up from his papers with mild irritation. "Mr. Cole, isn't it? I don't believe this matter concerns you." Jeremiah dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd learned long ago that silence could be more intimidating than shouting, and his physical presence alone had ended more than one potential confrontation during his infrequent trips to town. He walked to where Sariah knelt in the dirt and extended his hand to help her rise. She looked up at him with a mixture of hope and confusion. This strange mountain man who'd never spoken to her, but now offered assistance when her own neighbors hung back in cowardly silence. His pale eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating appearance, and she accepted his help in standing while Katie pressed close against her side. The pockmarked enforcer released Katie's arm and stepped back, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Mister, you'd best move along. This is official business." Jeremiah positioned himself between the men and the woman and child, saying nothing but making his intentions clear through posture and proximity. His own Colt remained holstered, but his stance suggested familiarity with violence and a readiness to employ it if necessary. For a long moment, the tableau held, predators and protector measuring each other while the crowd held its collective breath. Then Croft cleared his throat and attempted to reassert control of the situation. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Harwell's situation, but the law is quite clear in matters of debt collection. Perhaps you'd like to review the relevant statutes before involving yourself in affairs beyond your understanding." Jeremiah's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the banker. Though he made no threatening gestures, something in his bearing suggested that Croft's words carried less weight than the banker might have hoped. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Webb finally spoke up, his voice tight with nervous energy. "Maybe we should come back later, Mr. Croft. Give folks time to think things through. An excellent suggestion." "Sheriff," Croft agreed, though his tone suggested the delay was tactical rather than merciful. "Mrs. Harwell, you have until tomorrow morning to make arrangements for an orderly transfer of assets. I trust you'll use the time wisely." As the 3 men withdrew, Jeremiah remained motionless until their buggy disappeared around the bend toward town. Only then did he turn to face Sariah, who was staring at him with gratitude and bewilderment in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I don't know why you helped us, but thank you." Jeremiah nodded once and touched the brim of his hat before walking back to Scout. As he rode away, he could feel the weight of the crowd's stares and hear the buzz of conversation his intervention had sparked. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope, or perhaps just the echo of the man he'd been before the war took. Everything away, the evening shadows stretched long across the valley when Sariah finally worked up the courage to walk the mountain trail to Jeremiah's cabin. Katie walked beside her, clutching the corn-husk doll her father had made during his final winter, a simple toy crafted from dried husks and scraps of fabric, but precious beyond measure as one of the few tangible connections to Benjamin's memory. The child had insisted on coming, declaring that she wanted to thank the man who'd saved them. Though Sariah suspected her daughter's fearlessness might succeed where her own nervousness would fail. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail. its solid construction and neat maintenance speaking to the character of its inhabitant. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and lamplight glowed warmly through the single window. Sariah hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain about disturbing a man who clearly valued his solitude. Katie had no such reservations. She marched up to the heavy wooden door and knocked with the confidence of a child who had never learned to fear rejection. "Mr. Cole." "It's Katie Harwell. Mama and I came to say thank you." The door opened to reveal Jeremiah's imposing figure, though his expression softened when he saw the small girl looking up at him without a trace of the fear most people showed. He nodded gravely and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter with the same formal courtesy he might have shown to visiting generals during his military days. The cabin's interior surprised Sariah with its orderliness and simple comfort. Everything had its place. Cooking utensils hung neatly on wooden pegs, books lined a shelf near the fireplace, and military precision showed in the arrangement of furniture and supplies. A small writing desk sat beneath the window, equipped with paper, ink, and pens that suggested regular use despite his inability to speak. Jeremiah gestured toward the two chairs near the fireplace and busied himself preparing coffee with practiced efficiency. Katie settled into the larger chair with unconscious ease, swinging her legs and examining her surroundings with bright curiosity. "This is a nice house," she announced. "Did you build it all by yourself?" He nodded, then moved to his writing desk and returned with a piece of paper on which he'd written 5 summers to finish. "Started with just the foundation. That's a long time," Katie observed seriously. "But it's very strong. Mama says strong things last longer." She held up her cornhusk doll. "Papa made this for me before he went to heaven. Mama says I should take good care of it because it's all I have left of him." Something flickered across Jeremiah's scarred features at the mention of loss and memory. He knelt beside Katie's chair, his massive frame somehow managing not to appear threatening as he examined the doll with gentle attention. The child's easy acceptance of his scarred appearance and silent communication seemed to unlock something in him that had been closed for decades. Sariah watched this interaction with growing amazement. Katie had always been friendly with adults, but there was something special in the way she responded to Jeremiah, as if she recognized a kindred spirit despite the obvious differences in their circumstances. "She doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly," Sariah said softly. Jeremiah returned to his desk and wrote, "Children see clearer than adults." No pretense. The simple wisdom of his observation struck Sariah with unexpected force. In her world of constant worry about appearances, debts, and social standing, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to encounter genuine simplicity. "I wanted to thank you for what you did today," she said. "I don't know why you helped us, but—" He was already writing again, his pen moving with surprising speed across the paper. "Wrong is wrong. Some things don't need explaining." Katie giggled as she watched him write. "Why don't you talk with your mouth instead of writing everything down?" Sariah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Katie, that's not polite to ask." But Jeremiah was already reaching for his pen again, seemingly unbothered by the child's directness. "Hurt my throat in the war." "Writing works fine. Does it hurt now?" Katie asked with the matter-of-fact concern children showed for physical ailments. He touched his throat briefly, then shook his head. Katie accepted this explanation with the easy adaptability of youth and moved on to examining the books on his shelf. "Can you read all of these?" Another nod, followed by a written note. "Books are good company. Never argue or ask for anything." The coffee was ready, and Jeremiah served it in tin cups that matched everything else in the cabin, functional, well-maintained, and utterly without pretension. Sariah found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. There was something deeply peaceful about this place, something that spoke to a part of her that had been strung tight with tension for months. "Mr. Cole," she began carefully, "those men who came today, they'll be back tomorrow, with more legal papers and probably more men to enforce them. I appreciate what you did, but I don't want you getting in trouble on our account." Jeremiah's expression grew serious as he wrote, Croft's been buying up land all over the territory. Uses legal tricks to steal from families who can't fight back. This revelation sent a chill through Sariah. She'd assumed their situation was unique, a consequence of Benjamin's poor judgment in borrowing money the farm couldn't support. You mean we're not the first? Third family this year. Others didn't have anyone to help them. The implications of this information settled over Sariah like a weight. If their situation was part of a larger pattern, then appealing to Croft's better nature was pointless. There was no better nature to appeal to. What happened to the other families? Jensen family moved back east, lost everything. Widow Carmichael works in Croft's house now. Daughter sent to work in Denver. Katie looked up from the book she'd been examining. What does that mean, Mama? Sariah struggled to find words that would explain adult cruelty in terms a child could understand without terrifying her. It means some people take things that don't belong to them, sweetheart. That's stealing, Katie said firmly. Papa always said stealing was wrong. Jeremiah nodded approvingly and wrote, Your papa was right. But sometimes thieves wear fancy clothes and use big words to make stealing sound legal. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Jeremiah immediately extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, his entire demeanor shifting to alert wariness. Through the gathering dusk, they could see 3 riders approaching, Sheriff Webb and the same 2 enforcers from that afternoon. Mrs. Harwell, Webb called out. We know you're in there. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized people. Jeremiah was already moving, gathering items from various parts of the cabin with military efficiency. He handed Sariah a piece of paper that read, Back door leads to root cellar. Wait there until they leave. I won't hide while you face them alone, Sariah whispered. He was writing again, faster now, not facing them, leading them away. Take Katie and hide. Before she could protest further, he'd moved to the back of the cabin and opened a concealed door she hadn't noticed before. The space beyond was clearly designed as a hiding place, lined with food stores and equipped with blankets and water. Katie seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and followed her mother without complaint. From their hiding place, they heard Webb's voice growing more insistent, then the sound of the front door opening. Jeremiah's boots crossed the floor above them, then moved outside. Male voices exchanged words they couldn't quite make out, followed by the sound of horses moving away from the cabin. They waited in the darkness for what felt like hours before the back door opened, and Jeremiah's familiar silhouette appeared. His written message was brief, gone for now, but they'll be back. Need to make plans. As they returned to the warmth of the cabin's main room, Sariah realized that accepting Jeremiah's help meant entering a world she didn't understand, a world where good people had to hide from those who claimed to represent law and order. But looking at Katie's trusting face in the lamplight, she knew she had no choice but to trust this silent guardian who'd already risked more for them than anyone else had dared. The decision to move Sariah and Katie to the mountain cabin came at dawn, when smoke rising from the direction of their homestead told the story Webb's men had hoped to hide. Jeremiah had ridden down before first light to assess the situation and returned with grim news written on paper. Cabin burned. They're claiming you ran off in the night, abandoning the property. Sariah stared at the distant smoke with numb disbelief. The little cabin where she'd spent 4 years building a life with Benjamin, where Katie had taken her first steps and spoken her first words, was gone. With it went the last tangible connection to the dreams they'd shared when the territory still seemed full of promise instead of threats. Why would they burn it? She asked. Though part of her already knew the answer, Jeremiah's written reply confirmed her fears. Easier to claim abandonment if there's nothing left to abandon. Also sends message to anyone else thinking of fighting back. Katie took the news with the resilience children showed in the face of disasters they couldn't control. Will we live in the mountains now? She asked, as if moving to a remote cabin was an adventure rather than exile. For a while, sweetheart, Sariah said, trying to keep despair from her voice, until we figure out what comes next. The mountain cabin felt different as a permanent refuge rather than a brief sanctuary. Jeremiah cleared space in his single room, for their few rescued possessions, moving his own belongings with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. The sleeping arrangements required delicate negotiation. Katie would share the bed with her mother, while Jeremiah insisted he preferred sleeping near the fireplace anyway, wrapped in his military-issued blankets. As they settled into this new reality, Sariah found herself studying their silent host with growing curiosity. The cabin's orderliness spoke to military training, but personal touches revealed depths she hadn't expected. A shelf of books included poetry alongside military histories and practical manuals. Sketches tucked between pages showed landscapes and wildlife drawn with surprising skill. Most intriguingly, a wooden box beneath his writing desk contained what appeared to be letters. Though from whom or about what remained a mystery, Katie had no such reservations about exploring their host's private world. She discovered the sketches within hours and declared them prettier than pictures in books. When Jeremiah found her examining his artwork, instead of being annoyed at the invasion of privacy, he seemed pleased by her appreciation. "Did you draw this mountain?" she asked, holding up a detailed rendering of the peak visible from the cabin's window. He nodded and wrote, "Drew it last winter. Snow makes everything look different. Will you teach me to draw?" The request seemed to surprise him, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded again. Within minutes, he'd produced paper and pencils, settling beside Katie at the table with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. Watching them together, Sariah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude for Jeremiah's kindness warred with guilt at imposing on his solitude and uncertainty about what this strange arrangement might mean for Katie's future. Her daughter deserved stability, education, and the company of other children, none of which the mountain cabin could provide indefinitely. "She needs to be in school," Sariah said during a quiet moment while Katie napped, "and around other people her age." Jeremiah considered this, then wrote, "Agnes Pine comes up here sometimes, brings books, teaches reading to anyone who wants to learn. Could arrange lessons." This revelation surprised Sariah. She'd seen the school teacher in town, but had no idea Agnes made regular trips to the mountains. Why does she come here? Grew up on frontier. Understands that learning doesn't only happen in schoolhouses. The explanation rang true. Agnes Pine had struck Sariah as someone with firm convictions about education and justice. The idea that she regularly traveled dangerous mountain trails to teach isolated families spoke to a dedication that commanded respect. Their conversation was interrupted by Katie's excited voice from across the room. "Mama, look. There's a secret drawer." She'd been exploring the writing desk while they talked and had apparently discovered a hidden compartment. Before either adult could stop her, she'd pulled out a bundle of official-looking papers tied with military ribbon. Jeremiah moved faster than Sariah had ever seen anyone move, crossing the room in 3 strides and gently but firmly taking the papers from Katie's hands. His face had gone pale, and something in his expression suggested the child had stumbled onto secrets he'd never intended to share. "I'm sorry," Katie said, immediately recognizing she'd done something wrong. "I didn't mean to be nosy," but Jeremiah was already kneeling beside her, his expression softening as he wrote a quick note. "Not your fault. Some papers are private, that's all." Sariah found herself intensely curious about what those documents might contain, but respected his obvious desire for privacy. "Katie, remember what we talked about looking through other people's things? That it's not polite unless they say it's okay," Katie recited dutifully. Jeremiah seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment, then made a decision that clearly cost him something. He untied the ribbon and extracted a single document from the bundle, his military discharge papers. The official seal and formal language identified him as Captain Jeremiah Cole, 5th Pennsylvania Infantry, with commendations for distinguished service at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. Sariah read the document with growing amazement. The man who'd been living as a silent hermit had been a decorated war hero, an officer who'd led men in some of the conflict's bloodiest battles. The discharge papers told a story of courage and leadership that seemed at odds with his current isolation. "You were a captain," she said softly. He nodded, then wrote, "Different life, different man." "The same man," she corrected gently. "Just one who's been carrying too much alone." Katie studied the official papers with the serious attention she gave to anything involving adult mysteries. "Were you very brave in the war?" Jeremiah's response took longer to write than usual. "Tried to keep my men alive. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes didn't. The ones who didn't come home were braver than me." The simple honesty of his answer revealed more about his character than any official commendation could. Sariah began to understand that his isolation wasn't just about physical injury. It was about the weight of responsibility and loss that some men carried long after the shooting stopped. As evening approached, they fell into domestic routines that felt surprisingly natural. Katie helped prepare dinner with the enthusiasm she brought to everything, while Sariah found herself appreciating the simple pleasure of cooking for people who were grateful for whatever she provided. Jeremiah contributed to the meal preparation with the same methodical care he applied to everything else, his movements around the small space somehow avoiding collision despite his size. After dinner, Katie convinced Jeremiah to continue her drawing lesson by lamplight. She proved an apt pupil, her small fingers managing to capture basic shapes and proportions under his patient guidance. Watching them work together, Sariah felt something she hadn't experienced since Benjamin's death, a sense of family warmth that had nothing to do with blood relations and everything to do with mutual care and respect. "I can't stay here forever," she said quietly when Katie had finally fallen asleep. Jeremiah nodded and wrote, "But we can stay long enough to make a plan. Croft won't give up easily, but he's not the only one with resources." The promise implicit in his words gave Sariah the first real hope she'd felt in months. Perhaps they truly weren't alone in this fight after all. 3 days into their mountain exile, Jeremiah made a decision that surprised even himself. He saddled Scout before dawn and rode down the treacherous back trails toward a settlement 20 miles northeast of Dry Creek, where Murphy O'Brien ran a small cattle operation with his wife and grown sons. The two men hadn't spoken since the war's end, but some bonds forged in battle never truly broke. Even when separated by decades of silence, O'Brien's ranch house sat in a sheltered valley, surrounded by good grazing land and the kind of prosperity that came from honest work and careful management. Jeremiah approached openly, knowing that his old sergeant would have spotted him long before he reached the front gate. True to form, Murphy emerged from the barn before Jeremiah had fully dismounted, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile the mountain man had seen in years. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy said, his Irish accent still thick after 30 years in America. "Captain Jeremiah Cole, as I live and breathe. Though I heard you'd taken a vow of silence like some kind of monk." Jeremiah nodded and produced paper and pen from his saddlebag, writing quickly, "Need your help, Murphy. Situation in Dry Creek involves corruption and child in danger." The big Irishman read the note with growing seriousness, his jovial expression fading as understanding dawned. "Come inside, Captain. Sounds like we need to talk properly." Inside the comfortable ranch house, Murphy's wife Ellen fussed over their unexpected guest, while Murphy pulled out a bottle of Irish whiskey that had been aging since before the war. The familiar ritual of military men gathering to discuss serious business felt both foreign and natural to Jeremiah after so many years of isolation. "Now then," Murphy said, settling into his chair with the whiskey between them, "tell me about this corruption and don't spare the details." Jeremiah's written account took nearly an hour to complete, covering everything from Benjamin Harwell's suspicious death to the banking consortium's systematic land grabbing. Murphy read each page carefully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his continued sharp intelligence despite his rural retirement. "Harrison Croft," Murphy said when the account was finished. "I've heard that name before. Word is, he's got backing from Eastern investors who want mineral rights throughout the territory. They're not particular about how they acquire those rights. This confirmation of Jeremiah's suspicions brought both relief and concern. Having his fears validated meant they were dealing with more than local corruption. But it also suggested the scope of their opposition was far greater than one small-town banker. The question is, Murphy continued, what do you intend to do about it? Because if you're thinking of taking on a territorial conspiracy, you're going to need more than righteous anger and mountain survival skills. Jeremiah wrote, need to gather evidence, find out who else is involved. Protect Sariah and Katie while building case for federal authorities. Murphy nodded approvingly. Sound strategy, Captain. But you'll need allies who understand how these political games work. And you'll need to accept that some battles can't be won with silence and isolation. That afternoon, Jeremiah returned to the mountain cabin with renewed purpose and devastating news. While he'd been consulting with Murphy, Sariah had made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about her husband's death. She was waiting for him in the cabin's main room, Benjamin's old leather journal open on the table before her. Katie sat nearby, working on a drawing that showed remarkable improvement under Jeremiah's patient instruction. The contrast between the child's innocent concentration and her mother's expression of shocked revelation struck him immediately. I found this hidden behind a loose board near the fireplace, Sariah said without preamble. Benjamin knew about the silver deposits on our land. He knew exactly what Croft was after. Jeremiah read the journal entries with growing amazement. Benjamin Harwell had been far more knowledgeable about geology and mining than anyone realized. His careful survey work had identified significant silver deposits running through their property and extending into the surrounding hills. More importantly, his final entries revealed that he'd refused multiple offers to sell the mineral rights. Despite mounting pressure from banking representatives, the last entry, dated just 2 days before his death, was particularly chilling. Croft made final offer today. When I refused again, he said some people are too stubborn for their own good. Something in his eyes made me fear for Sariah and Katie's safety if anything happens to me. Have hidden survey maps and mineral samples where only she would think to look. If I'm right about the silver veins, our little homestead sits on a fortune worth more than anything Croft could steal through legal trickery. He didn't die in an accident, Sariah said quietly. They killed him because he wouldn't sell. Jeremiah nodded grimly and wrote, murder disguised as accident. Common practice when legal methods fail. Katie looked up from her drawing, sensing the adult's tension without understanding its source. Why are you both sad? Did something bad happen? Sariah struggled to find words that would acknowledge the child's perception without burdening her with adult knowledge. We learned something important about Papa, sweetheart. Something that explains why those men want our land so badly. Because Papa found treasure. Katie asked with the matter-of-fact acceptance children showed for adult mysteries. Something like that, Sariah confirmed, amazed once again by her daughter's intuitive understanding. The implications of Benjamin's journal transformed their situation from simple debt collection to conspiracy and murder. With documented evidence of the silver deposits and Benjamin's recorded suspicions about Croft's methods, they now had the foundation for a real legal challenge. But they also had proof that their opponents were willing to kill to achieve their goals. We need help, Sariah said. Real help from people who understand how to fight this kind of corruption. Jeremiah was already writing, Murphy O'Brien can be trusted. Knows people in territorial government who aren't bought by Eastern money. Also mentioned school teacher Agnes Pine might be more useful ally than we realized. This last point intrigued Sariah. She'd seen Agnes in town, but had never had opportunity for real conversation. What makes you think she can help? Murphy says she corresponds regularly with territorial officials about education funding. Has connections in federal government through teaching associations. Also grew up in mining territory, understands how mineral rights work. The idea of approaching Agnes Pine for help felt like the first positive step they could take in their own defense. Unlike the townspeople who'd stood silently while Croft's men threatened Katie, the schoolteacher had shown visible distress at the proceedings. Perhaps she would prove more willing to take active opposition to the banking consortium's methods. "There's something else," Sariah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The journal mentions hidden mineral samples. If Benjamin was right about the silver veins, we might have physical proof of what our land is really worth." Jeremiah considered this, then wrote, "Evidence could prove your case or get you killed faster. Depends on who we trust with information." The weight of that choice settled over them like mountain fog, thick, obscuring and impossible to ignore. They now had the knowledge and evidence needed to fight back against Croft's conspiracy, but using that evidence would require trusting people they barely knew and revealing secrets that had already cost one life. As evening approached, they sat in contemplative silence while Katie continued her drawing, blissfully unaware that her father's hidden journal had just transformed their desperate flight into something resembling a counterattack. For the first time since Benjamin's death, Sariah felt like they might have weapons to match their enemies' legal and financial advantages. But weapons were only as good as the courage and skill of those who wielded them, and she wasn't sure any of them were prepared for the kind of war Benjamin's discoveries had made inevitable. Agnes Pine arrived at Jeremiah's cabin on a crisp morning, when mountain mist still clung to the pine branches like gossamer threads. She rode a sturdy mare with the confidence of someone accustomed to traversing difficult terrain, her practical riding dress and worn leather saddlebag speaking to functionality over fashion. More importantly, she carried a small telegraph key in her saddlebag, a secret connection to the outside, world that few in Dry Creek knew existed. The schoolteacher had received Jeremiah's carefully worded message through Murphy O'Brien, and her response had been immediate and affirmative. She understood the gravity of their situation and possessed resources they desperately needed. As she dismounted and secured her horse, her intelligent brown eyes took in the defensive positioning of the cabin and the subtle signs that its inhabitants were living under threat. "Mr. Cole," she said with a nod toward Jeremiah, then turned to Sariah with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Harwell, I'm so sorry for everything you've endured. The way those men treated you and your daughter was unconscionable." Katie emerged from the cabin at the sound of voices, her natural curiosity overcoming any shyness about meeting new people. "Are you the teacher lady?" she asked directly. "I am indeed," Agnes replied, crouching to Katie's eye level. "And I hear you've been learning to draw. Would you like to show me some of your work?" While Katie eagerly retrieved her sketches, Agnes explained her presence to the adults. "I've been documenting irregularities in territorial land transfers for months. The pattern of forced sales and mysterious accidents has been impossible to ignore. Your situation, Mrs. Harwell, appears to be part of a much larger scheme." Jeremiah wrote quickly, "How much larger?" Agnes consulted a small notebook from her bag. "At least 15 families across 3 counties. All involved mineral-rich properties, all faced similar debt collection methods, all either sold under duress or lost their land through suspicious circumstances." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sariah had imagined their troubles were unique, a consequence of Benjamin's poor financial judgment. Learning that they were part of a systematic campaign of theft and intimidation was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least they weren't alone in facing this corruption. "I've been sending reports to territorial education officials," Agnes continued. "But my correspondence suggests the influence of this banking consortium reaches higher than I initially suspected. Federal intervention may be our only hope for real justice." She produced the telegraph key from her saddlebag with the pride of someone revealing a powerful weapon. "This belonged to my father, who served as a territorial surveyor. I've maintained contacts throughout the federal land office network. More importantly, I know people in Washington who specialize in investigating territorial corruption." Jeremiah examined the telegraph key with obvious appreciation for its potential value. In an age when information traveled at the speed of horses and stagecoaches, The ability to communicate instantly across vast distances represented enormous strategic advantage. "Can you reach federal marshals?" Sariah asked. "Better than that," Agnes replied. "I can reach Interior Department investigators who specialize in mineral rights fraud. But we'll need solid evidence, not just accusations and suspicions." Sariah exchanged glances with Jeremiah, silently debating how much to reveal about Benjamin's journal and the evidence it contained. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford to give carelessly, but Agnes Pine's documentation and federal connections made her their best hope for legitimate recourse. The decision was made for them when Katie, proudly displaying her drawings to Agnes, inadvertently revealed Benjamin's hidden survey maps. The child had found them while exploring the cabin's storage areas and had been using them as drawing paper, not understanding their significance. "Katie!" "No!" Sariah exclaimed, recognizing the geological notations that covered the papers. But the damage was done. Agnes studied the survey maps with growing excitement, her educated eye immediately recognizing their significance. "These are professional mineral surveys," she said breathlessly. "And they show substantial silver deposits throughout this entire valley." Jeremiah wrote, "Her husband discovered the deposits, refused to sell mineral rights, died 2 days later in accident." The implications hit Agnes like a physical blow. "They murdered him for refusing to sell?" "We believe so," Sariah confirmed quietly. His journal documents increasing pressure from Croft and specific threats about being too stubborn for his own good. Agnes sat heavily in one of the cabin's chairs, the weight of this revelation clearly affecting her deeply. "I've been tracking property transfers and suspicious deaths, but I never made the direct connection between refusal to sell and subsequent fatal accidents. This changes everything." Over the following hours, they developed a comprehensive strategy for exposing the conspiracy. Agnes would use her telegraph connections to alert federal investigators while documenting the evidence they'd gathered. Murphy O'Brien would coordinate with other ranch owners who might have faced similar pressure. Jeremiah would provide security and tactical planning, his military experience proving invaluable for anticipating their opponents' likely responses. But their planning session was interrupted by an ominous development. Katie, who had been playing outside under Jeremiah's watchful eye, came running back to the cabin with news that chilled them all. "There are bad men coming up the trail," she announced breathlessly. "I saw them from the rocks where I like to draw. They have guns and they look angry." Jeremiah immediately moved to the window, confirming Katie's observation with a grim nod. 6 armed men were approaching the cabin, led by Sheriff Webb and including faces he didn't recognize, professional gunmen brought in specifically for this confrontation. Agnes quickly gathered her telegraph equipment and papers. "They can't know I'm here," she said urgently. "My federal contacts are our only hope if something happens to you." Jeremiah was already implementing defensive procedures he'd planned for exactly this situation. He led Agnes and Katie to the hidden root cellar, while Sariah insisted on staying to face whatever was coming. The approaching confrontation would test everything they'd built over the past week: trust, courage, and the fragile hope that justice might still be possible, in a territory where money seemed to matter more than law. "Mrs. Harwell," Webb's voice carried clearly across the mountain air, "we know you're in there, and we know you've been harboring evidence related to territorial crimes. Come out peacefully and we can discuss terms." But Jeremiah had heard similar offers before, during a war where surrender often meant death, regardless of promised terms. He checked his weapons with practiced efficiency, settling into defensive positions he'd hoped never to need again. Some fights couldn't be avoided, no matter how much a man valued peace and solitude. The mountain cabin that had been a refuge was about to become a battleground, and all their careful plans would be tested by violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. Outside, 6 men with guns waited for surrender that would never come. Inside, a former soldier prepared to break his long silence in the most permanent way possible. The standoff lasted 3 tense hours, with Webb's men surrounding the cabin while Jeremiah maintained defensive positions from within. But the confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with a development none of them had anticipated. Katie vanished during the confusion of a diversionary attack on the cabin's rear entrance. Agnes had taken the child deeper into the root cellar when the shooting started, but the hidden chamber had a second exit that Benjamin Harwell had excavated years earlier as an emergency escape route. Katie, frightened by the gunfire and wanting to help somehow, had slipped through the narrow tunnel, while Agnes was focused on operating her telegraph equipment to summon federal assistance. Child's disappearance wasn't discovered until the gunmen withdrew after nightfall, apparently satisfied that they delivered their message of intimidation. When Jeremiah and Sariah searched the root cellar and found it empty except for Agnes and her telegraph equipment, the mountain man's controlled composure finally cracked. Katie! Sariah's anguished cry echoed across the mountainside as they searched the area around the cabin. But there was no response, no sign of the child who had been their primary reason for fighting this impossible battle. Agnes emerged from the cellar with devastating news beyond Katie's disappearance. Her telegraph communications had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they faced. "I've been in contact with Interior Department investigators," she reported grimly. "The corruption reaches all the way to territorial. Judge Harrison Blackstone himself." She produced a forged document from her saddlebag, a mining deed that showed Blackstone's name as the secret owner of mineral rights throughout the region. The judge who would supposedly provide legal oversight of their case was actually the mastermind behind the entire land-grabbing scheme. "This isn't just about one banker stealing from desperate families," Agnes continued. "Blackstone has been using his judicial authority to legitimize theft on a massive scale. Every family that's lost their land, every suspicious death, every forced sale, he's been orchestrating it all while pretending to represent territorial justice." The revelation hit Sariah like a physical blow. The legal system she'd hoped might protect them was actually the source of their persecution. Judge Blackstone, who was scheduled to arrive in Dry Creek within days to resolve their case, was the very man who had ordered Benjamin's murder and now sought to steal their daughter. But it was Jeremiah's response to Katie's disappearance that marked the most dramatic transformation of all. For the first time in 20 years, words forced their way past the Confederate bullet lodged in his throat, emerging as a barely audible whisper that gradually strengthened into recognizable speech. "Katie," he managed, the single word scraping past damaged vocal cords like rusty metal. The effort left him gasping, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The child's danger had broken through barriers that 2 decades of isolation had built around his heart. "You spoke," Sariah said wonderingly. Even in the midst of her terror for her daughter's safety, Jeremiah nodded, touching his throat with amazement. "The child," he whispered hoarsely. "She called me Papa Jeremiah yesterday." "I heard her voice when the shooting started, calling for help." The emotional impact of his breakthrough was overwhelmed by the urgency of finding Katie, but Sariah understood that something profound had changed in their relationship to each other and to the fight they faced. Jeremiah's voice, damaged but functional, represented hope returning to a man who had given up on human connection. Their search through the night revealed Katie's trail leading down the mountain toward Dry Creek, but also signs that she hadn't been traveling alone. Boot prints in the soft earth suggested that someone had been following her, possibly one of Webb's men who had stayed behind during the withdrawal. By morning, they had their answer. A message arrived via one of Agnes's telegraph contacts. Katie was being held in the abandoned Silver Creek mine, the same location where Benjamin had first discovered the silver deposits that had cost him his life. The irony was deliberate and cruel. The child was imprisoned in the very place that had started this entire conspiracy. The message came with terms that revealed the full scope of Blackstone's ambitions. In exchange for Katie's safe return, Sariah would sign over not just her original homestead, but mineral rights to all adjacent properties that the banking consortium had identified as potentially valuable. The document would legitimize previous forced sales and provide legal cover for future acquisitions throughout the territory. They're not just stealing from us, Agnes realized as she studied the proposed agreement. They're using Katie as leverage to legitimize their entire criminal enterprise. When Sariah signs this document, every family they've robbed will have no legal recourse. Jeremiah's damaged voice grew stronger as anger fueled his determination. "We're not signing anything," he declared, each word still an effort but clearly audible. "We're getting Katie back and exposing this conspiracy, no matter what it costs." The plan that emerged from their desperate consultation combined Jeremiah's military experience with Agnes's knowledge of the local terrain and Murphy O'Brien's promised support from other ranch families who had been victims of the conspiracy. But it also required them to gamble everything on a direct assault against an enemy who held all the apparent advantages. Murphy arrived at the cabin before noon with 2 other war veterans, men who had served under Jeremiah during the conflict and still trusted his tactical judgment despite his years of isolation. Their presence brought the reunion full circle, transforming the silent hermit back into Captain Cole, the officer who had never lost an engagement during 4 years of desperate fighting. "The mine is heavily guarded," Murphy reported. "At least 8 men, including some professionals I don't recognize. But the terrain gives us advantages if we're willing to take risks." Jeremiah studied the hand-drawn maps Murphy had prepared, his strategic mind engaging fully for the first time since the war's end. "We go in after dark," he decided, his voice growing steadier with each planning session. 3 diversionary attacks to draw their attention, while the real assault comes through the old mining tunnels. Sariah insisted on participating despite the obvious dangers, her desperation to reach Katie overriding any concern for her own safety. "She's my daughter," she declared when the men tried to dissuade her. "I won't wait in safety while others risk their lives for my child." Agnes would coordinate communications with federal authorities who were finally beginning to respond to her carefully documented evidence. If they could rescue Katie and survive the assault, they would have the testimony and documentation needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. But as they prepared for what might be their final battle, each of them understood that they were fighting for more than one child's freedom. They were challenging a system of corruption that threatened every honest family in the territory, confronting evil that had taken root in the very institutions supposedly designed to protect the innocent. The abandoned Silver Creek mine had been the source of Benjamin Harwell's discoveries and the cause of his death. Now it would be the site where his family's fate and the future of justice in the territory would finally be decided. Jeremiah Cole had found his voice again, but whether that voice would have the chance to speak for the innocent remained to be seen. The war that had taken his speech 2 decades ago was about to resume, fought this time not between North and South, but between those who would sacrifice anything for profit and those who still believed some things were worth more than money. The Confederate sniper rifle emerged from its hiding place like an artifact from another lifetime. Wrapped in oiled canvas and preserved with the same meticulous care Jeremiah applied to everything in his mountain sanctuary. He unwrapped the weapon slowly, his scarred hands tracing the familiar contours of walnut stock and steel barrel, with the reverence of a man greeting an old friend he'd hoped never to need again. The rifle was a Whitworth .45-1. Caliber, captured from Confederate forces at Gettysburg and modified by Union armorers to suit Jeremiah's particular skills. Its hexagonal bore and precision-machined components made it deadly accurate at ranges that would challenge modern marksmen, let alone Civil War-era shooters. In Jeremiah's hands, it had been responsible for eliminating Confederate officers at distances that seemed impossible to those who witnessed his marksmanship. "I haven't touched this weapon in 20 years, he said quietly. his voice growing stronger with each passing hour as damaged vocal cords remembered their function. "Swore I'd never kill again after Appomattox." Sariah watched him clean and inspect the rifle with practiced efficiency, recognizing the transformation taking place before her eyes. The gentle mountain hermit, who had taught Katie to draw, was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more dangerous, a professional soldier preparing for the kind of work that had made him legendary among his fellow veterans. "Sometimes we don't get to choose," she replied softly. "Sometimes evil forces our hand." Murphy O'Brien and his two companions, Frank Morrison and Dutch van der Berg, had arrived with their own weapons and grim determination. These men had served under Captain Cole during some of the war's bloodiest campaigns, and their loyalty had survived 2 decades of civilian life. They understood what they were asking of their former commander and what it might cost him to become that man again. "The mine sits in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky ridges," Murphy reported, spreading hand-drawn maps across Jeremiah's table. 8 guards that we can see, probably more inside the tunnels with the girl. They've got good sight lines down the main approach. But the old mining equipment provides cover if we're careful. Frank Morrison, a lean man with prematurely grey hair and steady hands, studied the tactical situation with professional interest. "How do you want to play this, Captain? Straight assault or something more subtle?" Jeremiah considered the options while continuing his weapon preparation. The rifle's scope had been crafted by German opticians and remained remarkably clear despite its age. At 600 yards, he could put a bullet through a playing card, assuming his skills hadn't deteriorated during his years of isolation. "We use the terrain," he decided. Dutch takes position on the north ridge with his Spencer repeater. Frank approaches from the east, using the old ore cart tracks for cover. Murphy and I go in through the main mining tunnel system that connects to the abandoned shafts. "What about me?" Sariah asked firmly. The men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with including a civilian woman in their assault plans. But Jeremiah understood something they didn't. This wasn't just about military tactics. It was about a mother fighting for her child, and that kind of desperation could be more effective than years of training. "You'll be with me in the tunnels," he said after a long pause. "Katie will need to see your face when we find her. And if something happens to me, you'll be the one who gets her out." Agnes Pine had established her telegraph station in a concealed position overlooking the mine, where she could coordinate with federal authorities while documenting whatever transpired during the rescue attempt. Her messages to Washington had finally prompted action. Federal marshals were en route, but wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. Katie couldn't wait that long. As evening approached, each member of the rescue team made their personal preparations for what might be their final mission. Frank Morrison cleaned his service revolver with the same care Jeremiah showed his rifle, while Dutch van der Berg sharpened the fighting knife that had served him through 3 years of close-quarters combat. Murphy O'Brien wrote a letter to his wife, just in case he didn't return, to tell her himself how the mission ended. Sariah's preparations were both practical and emotional. She secured her hair beneath a man's hat and donned dark clothing, suitable for moving through mine tunnels. But she also spent long minutes holding Benjamin's journal, drawing strength from his words and promising his memory that Katie would come home safely. "He would have done the same thing," she said when Jeremiah found her reading by lamplight. "Benjamin would have fought anyone who threatened our daughter, no matter the odds." "He was a good man," Jeremiah replied, his voice now clear enough to carry genuine emotion. "Katie has the best of both parents in her. That strength will help her survive whatever they've put her through." The conversation revealed something both of them had been avoiding, the growing connection between them that went beyond their shared determination to protect Katie. In the space of a week, they had become something resembling a family, bound together by crisis, but sustained by genuine affection and respect. "When this is over," Sariah said carefully, "what happens then?" Jeremiah considered the question while checking his rifle's action one final time. "When this is over, we'll have choices we don't have now." "Good choices, I hope," The implied promise in his words gave Sariah courage for the dangers ahead. Whatever happened in the mine, she wouldn't face the future alone. The silent mountain man had found his voice again, and part of what he'd chosen to say was that he cared about her and Katie's welfare beyond this immediate crisis. As full darkness settled over the mountains, the rescue team moved into position with military precision. Dutch van der Berg took his post on the North Ridge, invisible among the rocks, but commanding a clear view of the mine's main approaches. Frank Morrison worked his way through the abandoned ore cart system, using rusted machinery and broken timbers for concealment. As he approached from the east, Murphy O'Brien and Jeremiah entered the old tunnel system through a concealed entrance Benjamin Harwell had discovered during his geological surveys. The tunnels were dark, cramped and dangerous, filled with unstable timbers and pockets of bad air that could kill as efficiently as any bullet. But they also provided the only route to Katie that didn't involve a frontal assault against impossible odds. Sariah followed close behind Jeremiah, trying to control her breathing as they navigated passages barely wide enough for a single person. The mountain pressed down around them like a living thing, and she found herself fighting claustrophobia as well as fear for her daughter's safety. They moved in complete silence, communicating through hand signals Jeremiah had taught her during their brief planning session. The mine's acoustics meant that any sound could carry for hundreds of yards through the interconnected tunnel system, alerting their enemies long before they reached Katie's location. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes, they heard voices echoing from deeper in the mine. Katie's voice, thin and frightened but unmistakably alive, calling out questions that received harsh responses from her captors. The sound of his surrogate daughter's distress triggered something primal in Jeremiah, a protective fury that had been building since her disappearance. "Easy, Captain," Murphy whispered, recognizing the signs of a man preparing to abandon caution in favor of direct action. "We stick to the plan, but plans had a way of changing when children's lives hung in the balance. And Jeremiah was already calculating how many men he could eliminate before they realized they were under attack. The rifle across his back felt familiar and reassuring. Like a part of himself, he'd forgotten he was missing. Above them, Agnes Pine's telegraph key chattered softly as she maintained contact with federal authorities, documenting everything for the official investigation that would follow. In the distance, Dutch van der Berg settled into his sniper's position and began the patient work of identifying targets through his rifle scope. The battle for Katie's freedom was about to begin, and every participant understood that failure meant more than one child's death. It meant the triumph of a system that valued profit over justice and treated innocent families as obstacles to be eliminated. The war between good and evil was resuming in the depths of a silver mine, fought by men who had already given their youth to similar battles, and a woman who had already lost too much to consider retreat. Captain Jeremiah. Cole was about to discover whether 20 years of silence had dulled his edge, or if some skills, once mastered, never truly left a man's soul. The first shot came from Dutch van der Berg's position on the North Ridge, the Spencer repeater's sharp crack echoing across the mountain valley like thunder. Through his scope, he had identified 2 sentries positioned near the mine's main entrance, and his bullet found its mark with the precision that had made him valuable during the war's most desperate engagements. The second guard dove for cover behind mining equipment, shouting warnings that brought armed men running from deeper within the mine complex. But Dutch was already working the Spencer's lever action, chambering a fresh round and tracking his next target with the patience of a hunter who understood that haste meant death. Frank Morrison heard the shooting and began his own assault from the eastern approach, using the abandoned ore cart system for cover as he advanced through rusted machinery and broken timber. His Navy Colt barked twice in quick succession, dropping one guard who had been trying to flank Dutch's position while pinning down 2 others behind an overturned mining cart. In the tunnels beneath the mine, Jeremiah and Sariah heard the gunfire and knew their carefully coordinated assault had begun. Katie's voice had grown louder and more frightened as her captors responded to the attack above. But at least they knew she was still alive and relatively close to their current position. "Stay behind me," Jeremiah whispered to Sariah, his damaged voice carrying clearly in the confined space despite its hoarseness. "When we find her, grab Katie and head back the way we came. Don't wait for me." Sariah nodded, though she had no intention of abandoning him if the situation turned desperate. They had come too far together to let fear separate them now, regardless of what military protocol might dictate about protecting civilians. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where mining equipment had been abandoned decades earlier, creating a maze of shadows and hiding places. Lamplight flickered from deeper in the complex, accompanied by harsh voices arguing about how to respond to the attack. Among those voices, Katie's frightened questions cut through the darkness, like accusations against her captor's cruelty. Jeremiah moved through the chamber with the fluid grace of a predator, his rifle ready but held low to avoid accidental discharge in the confined space. Every sound, every shadow, every shift in air current registered in his consciousness as he navigated terrain that could hide enemies or allies with equal efficiency. A guard emerged from a side passage, carbine raised and ready to fire at anything that moved. Jeremiah's response was instantaneous and silent, a knife throw that dropped the man before he could cry out warning. 20 years of mountain life had kept his reflexes sharp, even if he'd avoided using them for violence. "Mama!" Katie's voice rang out suddenly, much closer than before. "Mama, are you coming?" "Katie!" Sariah called back before Jeremiah could stop her, maternal instinct overriding tactical caution. "We're here, sweetheart." "We're coming!" The exchange revealed their position to every hostile within hearing range, but it also pinpointed Katie's location in the complex tunnel system. She was being held in what had been the mine's main processing chamber, probably 50 yards deeper into the mountain through passages that offered multiple opportunities for ambush. Above them, the firefight continued with increasing intensity. Dutch Vanderberg had eliminated 3 guards and pinned down 2 others. But reinforcements were arriving from the surrounding hills, men on horseback who had been stationed as backup in case the mine's security was challenged. His position on the North Ridge was becoming untenable as rifle fire concentrated on his location. Frank Morrison had fought his way to within 30 yards of the mine's main entrance, but found himself trapped behind mining equipment as crossfire from multiple directions made further advance impossible. His ammunition was running low, and the guards had positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at withdrawal. Murphy O'Brien reached Jeremiah and Sariah just as the situation above ground began to deteriorate. His face was grim with news that changed everything about their tactical situation. "More men coming," he reported tersely. "At least a dozen riders from the south. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes a siege instead of a rescue." The implications were clear. They had to reach Katie and extract her before reinforcements arrived, or risk being trapped in the mine with no hope of escape. The careful timing of their assault was falling apart as their enemies proved better prepared than anyone had anticipated. "Where is she?" Jeremiah asked. "Main chamber, maybe 50 meters that way." Murphy pointed deeper into the tunnel system. "But there's at least 4 men with her, and they know we're coming." Katie's torn dress ribbon appeared in Jeremiah's lamplight, a strip of blue fabric caught on a timber support beam. The child had managed to leave a trail marker even while being held captive, showing courage and intelligence that made her surrogate father proud even in the midst of mortal danger. "She's been leaving signs," Sariah whispered, recognizing her daughter's resourcefulness. "My brave girl." The gunfire above intensified as Dutch Vanderberg was forced to abandon his position under concentrated rifle fire. Frank Morrison's ammunition ran out entirely, forcing him to rely on his knife and whatever weapons he could scavenge from fallen enemies. Time was running out, and Katie Harwell's rescue had become a race against overwhelming odds. The main processing chamber opened before them like a cathedral of shadows and lamplight, its high ceiling supported by massive timber beams that had somehow survived decades of abandonment. In the center of the space, Katie sat on a wooden crate with her hands bound, surrounded by 4 armed men who had positioned themselves to command all approaches to their prisoner. Benjamin's old mining tools lay scattered around the chamber, pickaxes, shovels, and drilling equipment that spoke to the honest labor that had uncovered the silver deposits, now causing so much bloodshed. The irony wasn't lost on Jeremiah that they would need those same tools to complete Katie's rescue. "That's far enough," called out the leader of Katie's guards, a lean man with cold eyes and a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to violence. "Drop your weapons and step into the light where we can see you." Jeremiah emerged from the tunnel mouth with his hands partially raised, the rifle held loosely but ready for instant use. Behind him, Sariah fought every maternal instinct that screamed for her to rush toward her daughter, regardless of the consequences. "Katie, are you hurt?" Sariah called out. "I'm okay, Mama," Katie replied with a tremor in her voice that suggested she was trying to be braver than she felt. "They said you were coming to get me. We're here now, sweetheart," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying across the chamber with surprising strength. "Everything's going to be all right." The guard leader smiled coldly. "Captain Cole, I presume. Your reputation from the war precedes you, but this isn't Gettysburg, and you're outnumbered 4-1. 5-1, corrected another voice from the shadows. Sheriff Webb stepped into the lamplight, his gun drawn and pointed directly at Sariah. "Mrs. Harwell, you've caused us considerable inconvenience. Judge Blackstone is most displeased." The mention of Blackstone's name confirmed what they had suspected. The territorial judge was not just complicit in the conspiracy, but actively directing operations from behind his facade of legal authority. The corruption reached deeper than any of them had imagined. "Where is Blackstone?" Jeremiah asked, playing for time while assessing tactical options. "Close enough," Webb replied. "He'll be along shortly to personally oversee the resolution of this unfortunate situation." Above them, the sound of gunfire had ceased abruptly, either because Dutch Vanderberg and Frank Morrison had been killed or captured, or because the reinforcements had arrived in sufficient numbers to end the external battle. Either possibility meant their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Murphy O'Brien appeared at the tunnel entrance behind Jeremiah, his face grim with confirmation of their worst fears. "Dutch is down," he reported quietly. "Frank's position overrun. We're on our own." The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of conventional rescue. 5 armed men held Katie hostage in a chamber with limited cover and no alternate escape routes. The tunnel system that had brought them this far could easily become a trap if their enemies controlled the surface exits. But Jeremiah had faced worse odds during the war, and desperation could be a weapon more powerful than any rifle. He studied the chamber's layout with the eye of a man who had turned hopeless situations into victories through audacity and precise timing. "The child doesn't need to be part of this," he said to Webb. "Let her go, and we can settle our differences like adults." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Webb replied. "Judge Blackstone has specific plans for Miss Harwell. She represents valuable collateral for ensuring her mother's cooperation with our legal proceedings." The casual mention of using a child as leverage triggered something primal in Jeremiah's protective instincts. The Confederate bullet in his throat seemed to pulse with remembered pain. But his voice emerged clear and strong when he spoke again. Then, "We have nothing more to discuss." His movement was so sudden that Webb barely had time to register the threat before. Jeremiah's thrown pickaxe caught him in the chest, the heavy tool's impact driving him backward into the stone wall. Sariah dove toward Katie as gunfire erupted throughout the chamber, rolling behind Benjamin's old ore cart for protection. Murphy O'Brien's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession. Dropping 2 guards before their return fire forced him back into the tunnel entrance. The remaining guards scrambled for better positions among the mining equipment, their crossfire making any rescue attempt seemingly impossible. Katie proved her father's daughter by rolling off the crate and crawling toward her mother, despite her bound hands, showing the same courage that had carried Benjamin through years of frontier hardship. She reached the ore cart's shelter just as Jeremiah's, Rifle eliminated the guard leader with a shot that demonstrated his legendary marksmanship remained. Undiminished by 2 decades of disuse. Can you get us out of here? Sariah asked desperately as bullets spanged off the metal cart above their heads. Jeremiah smiled grimly while reloading his rifle. I've been getting people out of impossible situations for most of my adult life. This is just another day's work. But even as he spoke those confident words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the mine. Tunnels. Judge Blackstone's arrival with enough reinforcements to ensure that this particular impossible situation might finally be too much for even Captain Cole's legendary tactical skills to overcome. 6 months later, the silver mine that had been the source of so much tragedy had transformed into the foundation of the Harwell family's prosperity. Federal investigators had confirmed Benjamin's geological surveys with stunning accuracy. The silver deposits extended throughout the mountain valley in veins so rich they promised decades of profitable extraction. The new land deed, properly recorded in Sariah's name with federal oversight, represented not just legal ownership, but the security she had fought so desperately to protect. The mine's main office sat where the old processing chamber had witnessed their final confrontation with Judge Blackstone's corruption. That battle had ended when Agnes Pine's federal contacts arrived with a full company of territorial marshals, just as Jeremiah was preparing for what might have been his last stand. Blackstone himself had been arrested while trying to flee the territory, his carefully constructed empire of legal theft collapsing as evidence of his crimes spread throughout the territorial capital. Jeremiah Cole stood in the office doorway, watching Sariah review mining reports with the same careful attention Benjamin had once given to his geological surveys. His voice had grown stronger with each passing month. Though he still chose his words carefully, a man who had learned to value speech precisely because he had lived so long without it. The Eastern Tunnel is producing better than expected, Sariah reported, looking up from her papers with the satisfied expression of a woman who had found her calling in business management. If these numbers hold steady, we'll be able to provide employment for half the territory within 2 years. The mine's success had transformed Dry Creek from a struggling frontier town into a thriving community where honest work received honest pay. Many of the families who had been driven from their lands by Blackstone's conspiracy had returned to find opportunities in the expanding mining operation or in the businesses that supported it. Agnes Pine had accepted the position of territorial education supervisor, using her federal connections to establish proper schools throughout the region. Her telegraph equipment, once hidden for clandestine communication with Washington investigators, now served as the official territorial communications center, a symbol of how tools used to fight corruption could become instruments of legitimate progress. "Katie wants to show you something," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the warmth that had developed during their gradual transformation from desperate allies into something resembling a family. The child in question came running from the mine's entrance, her blue dress clean and well-fitted, a far cry from the torn ribbons she had left as trail markers during her captivity. At 9 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, though she still carried the corn-husk doll her father had made during those final winter months before his death. "Papa Jeremiah, look what I found," she announced, holding up a piece of silver ore that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "Mr. O'Brien says it might be the richest sample yet." Murphy O'Brien emerged from the mine shaft behind her, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of a man who had found meaningful work in his retirement years. As mine foreman, he oversaw operations with the same attention to detail that had made him invaluable during their military service. "The child has an eye for quality ore," Murphy confirmed with obvious pride. "Spotted this piece in a tunnel most adults would have missed entirely." Katie beamed at the praise, then turned to Sariah with the earnest expression she wore when making important announcements. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to be a geologist, like Papa Benjamin. I want to find treasures hidden in the mountains, Sariah smiled at her daughter's ambition, remembering Benjamin's own fascination with the secrets hidden beneath Wyoming's rugged landscape. "Then we'll make sure you get the education you need to pursue that dream." "Sweetheart," the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar buggy carrying Doc Whitfield and an official-looking passenger. The elderly storekeeper had been appointed territorial liaison for federal mining oversight, his reputation for honesty making him valuable to investigators still working to untangle the web of corruption Blackstone had created. "Mrs. Harwell," Doc Whitfield called out as he climbed down from the buggy. "I'd like you to meet Deputy Marshal Harrison. No relation to our former judge. I'm pleased to report." The federal marshal was a serious man in his 40s, whose careful manner suggested the kind of thoroughness that had made the prosecution of Blackstone's conspiracy so successful. "Ma'am, I wanted to personally deliver the final documentation regarding your mineral rights. The federal government has officially recognized your ownership of all deposits within the designated territory." He handed Sariah a leather portfolio containing the new land deed, the legal document that represented everything she and Benjamin had dreamed of achieving when they first claimed their homestead. The difference was that this deed carried federal authority that no territorial judge could challenge or corrupt. "There's one more thing," Marshal Harrison continued. "The Interior Department has asked me to extend an offer for Mr. Cole to serve as Territorial Security Advisor, given his demonstrated expertise in dealing with organized criminal activities." Jeremiah considered the offer, while watching Katie examine her silver ore sample with the intense concentration she had inherited from both parents. The idea of returning to official service held appeal, but his priorities had changed during the months of family life that had followed their mountain exile. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I have responsibilities here that matter more than any official position." That evening, as the sun painted the Wyoming mountains in familiar shades of gold and amber, the three of them sat on the porch of their new house, built on the site where Sariah's original cabin had stood before Blackstone's men burned it down. Katie worked on her drawings while the adults discussed plans for expanding the mine's operations and the school system that would serve the growing community. "Sometimes I think about how different things might have been," Sariah said quietly, "if Benjamin had lived to see what we've built here." "He did see it," Jeremiah replied, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had learned to believe in purposes larger than individual ambition. "Every choice he made, every risk he took, was aimed at giving you and Katie exactly this kind of future." Katie looked up from her drawing, a detailed sketch of the mountain peak that dominated their valley, rendered with skill that would have made her father proud. "I think Papa Benjamin would like Papa Jeremiah," she announced, with the matter-of-fact wisdom children sometimes displayed. "I think he would too," Sariah agreed, reaching for Jeremiah's hand as they watched their daughter return to her artwork. The new land deed lay on the table between them, but it was Katie's laughter echoing across the valley that truly marked their victory over the forces that had tried to destroy their family. Some silences, Jeremiah reflected, needed to be broken for love to find its voice, and some voices once found were worth preserving for generations yet to come.